Okay, so this is a video intended to help you revise some of the key themes of Romeo and Juliet, having now completed the reading of the text. The structure of the lesson is that we're going to have a look at the plot, the characters, and some of the main themes of the play, and discuss and explore those with some of the main quotations. And then we're also going to understand some essential gold concepts, just looking at a couple of them this time with a view to looking at an extract for which these themes and ideas will be really important. Remember, our gold concepts are those that are the most ambitious and most impressive ideas about the text, and can be used by students across all levels in your essays to get the best marks. So this is the first thing that I'd like you to do, and I would advise you to spend maybe just 5 or 10 minutes having a look at this. This has 12 plot points of Romeo and Juliet. You can pause at this stage if you want to and pick it up again in about 10 minutes time. There are 12 plot events here, 1 to 12. You now need to put those into order. So read the things that are in the boxes, the blue boxes there, and put them into the correct order according to the events that take place in Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so once you've done that and you've ordered those, you can start now to mark these or put them into the correct order if you've got them incorrect, etc. If you just want to put numbers next to them, if you have made any errors, then you can order them correctly. Equally, if you want to use your red pen to write out a corrected version, that's equally fine as well. So the first event in this is that the story begins with a brawl in the street between the Montagues and the Capulets. If you remember that, do you bite your thumb at me, sir? I bite my thumb at you, sir. That whole exchange at the beginning between the Montagues and the Capulets that sets up the feud. Of course, before this, we have got the prologue, which tells us about the entire story. The prince dispels the fighting. He warns that anyone caught fighting again will be punished by death. That's event number 2. That's the ultimatum he gives, and of course, we know there is a huge amount of death in the play. We then meet Romeo, who is lovesick for Rosaline, and Benvolio persuades him to crash the Capulet ball. We have all those oxymorons used to describe his feelings for love and how conflicted he feels. He agrees to go to the Capulet ball, and at the ball Romeo and Juliet meet and kiss. Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, sees Romeo and wants to fight him, but is prevented from doing so by Lord Capulet, Juliet's father. Later, Romeo climbs up Juliet's balcony. They decide to get married the next day, despite the haste. Romeo and Juliet are married in secret by Friar Lawrence. Tybalt challenges Romeo to a fight. Romeo refuses, so Mercutio steps in and fights Tybalt instead. Tybalt kills Mercutio. Romeo then kills Tybalt in retaliation, and the prince banishes Romeo to Mantua. Romeo feels this is a punishment worse than death. However, he does spend the night with his new bride before he leaves for Mantua. Following this point, Juliet is then ordered by her father to marry Paris. To avoid marrying Paris, Juliet decides to fake her death with a sleeping drug. Romeo does not know about the plan and travels to see her body in the tomb. Romeo takes the poison and dies. Juliet wakes up and sees Romeo dead and stabs herself with Romeo's dagger. The death of the two lovers is the climax of the story, and the Montagues and the Capulets agree to stop fighting. So that's the correct order of the events. And in the exam, you'll get an extract, so you need to understand whereabouts that extract comes in the sequence of events, what's taken place before and what's taken place after, so that you can dip in and out of the extract really effectively. So in short, there you go, there's a short slide there with a summary of the entire story and just a few short points. If you find that more helpful, then that is there for you as well. So let's do a quick who's who in Romeo and Juliet, just to remind us. So there are 2 households, the Montagues and the Capulets. Romeo, Lord Montague, Lady Montague, Benvolio, Romeo's friend and cousin, and Mercutio, who is also Romeo's friend. Largely aligned with the Montagues rather than the Capulets, but really isn't part of either family by blood. Juliet, of course, is a Capulet. Lord Capulet and Lady Capulet are her parents. Tybalt is her cousin. Once again, Paris is not directly aligned with the Capulets by blood, but is planning to be aligned with them by marriage. He is a man of great esteem and a great match for Juliet within that society. The nurse is part of the Capulet household because, of course, she's employed by the Capulets. She cares for Juliet and has done since Juliet was a young child. Friar Lawrence is, of course, a support to both families and households as a man of God in that society at the time. And, of course, the prince rules the society and isn't part of either. So what I want us to do now is to do a bit of a brain splurge. Remember, a brain splurge is a really good way of seeing what you know and what you remember, and then updating that with any additional ideas. So you can do that with a series of mind maps. So for each character on the following slide, it's surrounded with ideas about them. You can use your blue or your black pen for your own ideas. So for instance, here's one for Romeo. He's initially in love with Rosaline, but that love is unrequited. He's a Montague, he's passionate and hasty in his actions, and that essentially is one of his fatal flaws. He's emotionally vulnerable and very immature. He believes in romantic love, he's very idealistic. He worships Juliet, his true love. He has a tendency for depression, overreaction, and extremes of emotion. He's not very good at managing those emotions, and he seems to look to the friar for guidance, kind of parental guidance, paternal guidance, rather than his parents. So you're going to do this process and then swap to your red pen when we share and check ideas afterwards. Okay, so let's now summarise what we know about each of those characters. If you swap to your red pen now, you can update your notes with anything additional that you might have missed. So, Juliet. We have Juliet often described using very heavenly language. She's elevated to heavenly as seen by Romeo. Her parents often use language initially that kind of aligns her with heaven and worship. There's lots of imagery used to describe Juliet as innocent. She initially seems to be very obedient towards her parents, but obviously that changes as she falls in love with Romeo. And of course that's where her father's attitude towards her changes. She is a little bit anxious initially when she first meets Romeo about the haste and the speed with which he wants them to progress their relationship, and so she seems a little bit more hesitant and aware of the expectations that are being placed upon her and the role that she's expected to fulfill. Benvolio, of course, is Romeo's cousin, his friend, and he is characterized as somebody who is benevolent. Remember, we've used the word nominative determinism, which means that the person's name indicates something about their character. So he's benevolent, he's kind, he's good. He's the one who often wants to avoid fighting. He says things like, put down your swords, you know not what you do, those kind of things. He tries to prevent the fighting that occurs between the households. When Mercutio is actually killed, he tries to encourage the men to disperse because he can feel that there is something simmering. But he is Romeo's friend, his confidant, the person who often allows Romeo to see and think with clarity when he's becoming very wrapped up in his own emotions. Tybalt, of course, the word Tybalt, the name Tybalt in terms of nominative determinism reminds us of the word tyrant. He's very much driven by kind of honour and dignity and family alliance. But he also is very much driven by kind of male aggression and representations of kind of his masculinity through violence and through aggression. He cannot stand for the Capulet name to be disparaged or mistreated, and he takes dishonour very seriously to defend his family name and to defend Juliet and to defend his uncle and all those kind of things. So he is quite a confrontational character. Lord Capulet is initially quite a doting father. He's got quite an unusual attitude initially. He doesn't believe that his daughter should be married off too early. He believes that she's still a child and she should be protected. But he does have very clear ideas and kind of upholds very patriarchal attitudes of the Elizabethan era about how Juliet should behave and what her duties are. And he's quite controlling in the language he uses towards her and towards his wife, Lady Capulet, and equally towards the nurse at times. So he comes across as quite a tyrannical character as the play progresses, and it's only when Juliet is taken away from them as a family that actually he starts to kind of soften again and return to some of that more fatherly, supportive language he uses at the beginning. Mercutio is another friend of Romeo's. He is intentionally quite controversial, quite confrontational. He enjoys a filthy joke and a bit of innuendo. He seems to be very keen to present love as something that's just sexual, and he tries to shatter Romeo's view of love that's very idealistic and romantic. He, of course, is equally, in a similar way to Tybalt, kind of driven by kind of male aggression, masculinity, honour, dignity. Once again, hates to see himself and his friends being disparaged and can be quite hot-headed. Mercutio, remember, often talks in blank verse and iambic pentameter in the way that lots of Shakespeare's language is written, but when he begins to lose his head or become overly emotional, he starts to speak in prose, and that's where we get the sense that Mercutio is becoming more confrontational and more challenging in the way that he's using language towards people, particularly at the point where he refuses to back down against Tybalt. Friar Lawrence, of course, acts as the fatherly figure for Romeo. He's in some ways complicit in the deaths because he sees that if he unites the two lovers, it might be a way to bring the feud to an end. But largely he has good intentions, and he also has kind of an experience in some ways as being an apothecary, somebody who's good with herbs and medicines and things. And it's that gives him the resources in the end to create the plan with Juliet. But he sees the marriage as something that could be a force for good. He doesn't really foresee the dangerous things, even though he does warn Romeo and Juliet about them. He kind of doesn't anticipate the outcome. He thinks he can control it. The nurse, of course, is kind of Juliet's maternal figure, much more than her mother at the time. He would have had a wet nurse at that time who would have fed children from their breast. The mother of a noble family would certainly not have fed her own children, so the nurse would have been employed to have cared for Juliet ever since the day of her birth, so their relationship is very close. In lots of ways she offers the maternal support and love that Juliet's quite cold mother doesn't provide, and again only wants the best for her, only wants to see her happy, so agrees to be complicit in the plan for the two lovers to marry. So those are just some additional annotations. If you haven't got any of those ideas, just add those on there in your red pen. Now we're going to move on to thinking about some of the Swiss Army quotations. Remember, Swiss Army quotations are quotations that do lots of things. So they've got lots of devices in, they relate to lots of gold, they allow you to talk about lots of complex ideas, they might have lots of opportunity for analysis of micro quotes, single words. So we're just going to go through just to contextualize where some of those Swiss Army quotations belong within the story and who says those lines. So for each one we'll just pause. You can see at the top left hand corner there you've got two key quotations that come from the prologue. Well done if you worked out that that was star-crossed lovers and death-marked love. This is said by the chorus in the prologue, and it establishes the theme of tragedy and the feud between the two families, reminds us of ideas to do with fatalism, star-crossed lovers, for instance, and the idea that the two of them are destined to be together, but also that their love is aligned from the beginning with death. Again, here we've got several more quotations. Have a look on the right-hand side, see if you can establish which quotations are said by who, and equally what the missing words are there. So it's Lord Capulet who says, with tears augmenting the fresh morning's dew, about Romeo, about his emotional vulnerability and immaturity when he can't stop crying over Rosaline. We've got a sequence of oxymorons, two contrasting words used side by side that are used by Romeo: brawling love, loving hate, used to show love is both pleasure and pain. He even uses a rhetorical question: is love a tender thing? It pricks like, and that simile is it pricks like thorn. The idea that love pierces you and ensnares you, but also harms you. Mercutio and the Queen Mab speech. Remember, this is what Mercutio says before the party begins. He's describing love as being parasitic and corrupting and shattering Romeo's romantic ideals about marriage. Can you remember what those words are? The fairies something, Queen Mab, and her traces of the smallest spider something. So it's fairies midwife, the smallest spider web, and hag, and the spider webs and the hag makes love seem kind of sinister, evil. It's kind of gothic imagery used to describe love, and challenges Romeo's views on love, sets up love as something dangerous. In the moment where Romeo and Juliet meet, who says these things? Juliet is the arise, fair son, and kill the envious, beauty too rich for use, something too dear, too like the something. So the top three are all said by Romeo. Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. So remember all of this raising Juliet to this heavenly esteem. The envious moon, making reference to Juliet and her kind of menstrual cycle and her role as a woman. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear, that idea of elevating her to heaven. She is almost too good for the earth. So all of this is about him idolizing Juliet. The final one is said by Juliet, too like the lightning, and that simile, too like the lightning, is her, remember, showing how hesitant she is about the idea of them moving too quickly. She's worried that their love will be fleeting and it won't last. Of course, at the party, Tybalt vows for vengeance. Remember, there's all those ideas about Tybalt that we've discussed just earlier on. But right at the beginning, in the very, very first fight between the Montagues and the Capulets, he uses this quotation. If you can remember what he says he hates, it's peace, I hate the word, which symbolises entirely his kind of love for violence and his kind of love for conflict. The pair marry in secret, but the friar warns them. These violent delights have violent ends. Remember, he's almost prophetic in his view that something might go wrong here, but he's not prepared for quite what it will be. He just warns them to be moderate and slow in what they're doing. Mercutio then the same day defends Romeo when Tybalt arrives to kill Romeo. And this is where we have that imagery of sickness in Verona. And equally that curse given from Mercutio at the point of his death. His final words, and he says this several times, are, if you can fill in that word there, a plague on both your houses. Mercutio dies and Romeo kills Tybalt. Romeo is banished. After their wedding night, Romeo goes into hiding and he goes into exile. But at this point, when we're talking about fatalism, and Romeo is talking about how he is at the mercy of fate, he says, I am something's fool. And that word is fortune's fool. Juliet is forced to marry Paris against her will. Her parents try to arrange that marriage to Paris. Her father, of course, becomes very, very angry with her. He calls her something, an abusive address term. If you can, fill that in. And the word is baggage. Hang thee, young baggage, disobedient wretch, as though she's an inconvenience, something that he can't shrug off and pass on to somebody else. She's a burden, she's a hindrance to his life. Fate, unfortunately, seems to conspire against them, but Romeo rejects his fate. He says, I defy you. Piece of celestial imagery here. I defy you. Stars is that quotation. The plan obviously goes madly wrong. The letter is lost. Romeo doesn't know that Juliet will wake. And this is where we have the climax, the moment where Romeo takes his life and Juliet takes her life. When Romeo dies, the first quotation is Romeo. This aligns love with death. He says, thus with a kiss I die. When Juliet dies, she uses this oxymoron, oh happy dagger. There rust and let me die reminds us of the eternal decay of Juliet's beauty and reminds us of her untimely death in her youth. And the final lines come from the prince who wills them to be united back together. And here we have biblical imagery, the quotation on the right hand side. You can fill that in. Heaven finds means to kill your joys with love. Okay. So that is the play in a nutshell in quotations, just so you can see whereabouts those appear. So this week's gold ideas are going to be the play as an exploration of parental guidance, the patriarchal reading of the text, and then we're going to relate these to an actual exam question and an extract question, like the kind that you would get in the exam. So first thing I want you to consider, and again, this is something for you to pause and have a think about and maybe jot down some notes. Who is the most to blame, in your opinion, for the deaths of the two lovers? Is it the parents? Is it Friar Lawrence? Is it the nurse? Is it Romeo and Juliet themselves? Is it Tybalt, or is it someone else? So pause there, have a think about that, jot down some notes. You could do that in bullet points, you could do it just in some ideas jotted down, you could do it just thinking if you prefer. So there's many arguments that we could have here. We could say that, who is most to blame for the deaths of the two young lovers? We could place the blame squarely at the feet of the parents. We could place it at the feet of the older members of the family for continuing the feud and passing that on to their children. We could certainly place that blame with Lord and Lady Capulet for forcing Juliet into that marriage and for treating her in such a way that she is viewed as being just an object that they can marry off and use as they wish to advance their station. We could even talk about the Montagues, who are kind of largely absent in Romeo's life and therefore lead him to be maybe rash and ill-advised in his behaviours. We could blame Clara Lawrence, because actually it's his plan that leads to the inevitable death. It's his miscommunication, it's the small errors, the things that fall through the net. He actually becomes complicit in their deaths, but because he's got an ulterior motive, he wants to bring the feud to a close. The nurse has some involvement in it, of course. She's the one who says to Juliet, you just need to marry Paris and just forget Romeo. He's exiled anyway. And so maybe she drives Juliet to that last bit of desperation. Is it Romeo and Juliet themselves? Are they simply too immature? Are they simply too quick in their actions? Are they too impulsive? Are they too passionate? Is it Romeo's more than Juliet? Because, of course, Juliet is hesitant, whereas he kind of forces things forwards. Is it Tybalt? Because Tybalt seems to be one of the characters who seems intent on continuing that feud. And when Romeo tries to kind of settle the feud and kind of calm things the day that Tybalt is killed, Tybalt refuses to accept that. Tybalt refuses to build any of those bridges between the two halves of the family. Or you might think it's somebody else. But whoever you think it might be, we're going to talk about parental guidance. Think about where you might have heard that before. That image might help you. So parental guidance is something that you often see comes along with film and cinema. It advises parents in that sense about what might be appropriate for their children to watch. But more generally, parental guidance means the kind of emotional, physical, spiritual guidance your parents give you in terms of teaching you all the things you need to know in the world. We are born a certain way with our nature, but our nurturing, our understanding of the world and the people we develop into, many people argue, comes from the guidance you receive from your parents. So again, something else for you to pause and think about. What things are provided for children by their parents, both physically and emotionally? And what values and principles do we learn from our parents? So again, we'll just pause there. And you can once again jot down some ideas, do a bit of a mind map, think about that, maybe discuss it with somebody else. Okay, so when you've done that, there are two things really that children receive from their parents. Some of them are physical needs, some of them are emotional needs. A psychologist called Maslow, he created a hierarchy of needs. If you wanted to, you could have a little look at some more of this to understand a bit more about the importance of nurturing, because it's also important for Frankenstein, this idea. But parents provide physically a roof over your head, food, those kind of things, but they also provide for you emotionally in terms of emotional support. They help you to develop as a well-rounded, empathetic person, somebody who's able to manage their emotions, somebody whose mental health is supported by the fact that your parents give you positive self-esteem, reinforce the fact that you are important to them, important in society. They help to give you a sense of belonging and a sense of love and support. But equally, some of the principles that we learn from our parents are often to do with kind of morals, right and wrong, evaluating risk and things like that. Now, in Romeo and Juliet, you could argue that the play is an exploration of parental guidance, because that parental guidance is largely absent for Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo's case, he seems to have slightly absent parents who don't seem to understand him enormously, seem to struggle to understand his plight and his depression when he's upset about his love for Rosaline, but equally they kind of dismiss it. They don't communicate well with Romeo. They think he's kind of idealistic and don't necessarily agree with his views about love. for Juliet, her parents, the relationship is much more driven by kind of a coldness, a distance, and kind of this idea of controlling their daughter. For Lady Capulet, she's very distant. You know, she uses words like "my daughter," "bring my daughter to me." She reminds Juliet of her duties. Her father, of course, is initially very loving and supportive and wants to protect her, but later on, he becomes quite tyrannical and quite controlling in the way that he treats her as soon as she disobeys him. So because of that, there are two other characters in the play that become almost the parental guides that Romeo and Juliet are missing elsewhere, and that's the friar and the nurse. So the friar and the nurse provide that parental love and guidance that is absent, but it leads to them becoming complicit in the lovers' deaths because they almost try to act in their best interests, but unfortunately seem to make the situation worse. For the friar, he of course organises the marriage and thinks that it'll bring an end to the feud, and of course it creates a sequence of events that inevitably spirals things. And again, the nurse becomes the kind of envoy, the go-between who delivers the messages, who advises Juliet what to do, who essentially gives her the approval and to marry Romeo, and tells her that she thinks it's a good idea for her happiness. But we can see in the language that they use, the friar is concerned about the things that might occur. He says to them when Romeo comes to him and asks to be married, "Wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast." So he warns Romeo about his haste. And actually at the moment where they're married, he says, "These violent delights have violent ends." He almost has this prophecy. Prophecy is looking ahead into the future and kind of having this ability to see into the future. And he almost knows that something bad is going to occur here, but it's 10 times worse than he can envisage. The nurse, on the other hand, uses lots of very, very, very maternal language, and it's almost like she's a stand-in mother for the kind of cold and absent mother that Juliet has. She calls her a lamb, she calls her a ladybird. She uses that innocent and delicate, beautiful imagery to describe her. She also says she can remember her age and to the hour, so we know that she's been there all the way through Juliet's nurturing. So Juliet trusts her judgment, and equally looks to her for kind of approval and support. So we could argue that the friar and the nurse become complicit in the deaths. If we keep thinking about this idea of parenthood, we can start to think about patriarchy. Now you might think from your annotations you remember that word, and if you do, that's great. So patriarchy is a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. If we look at the etymology of that word, that just means the way it's broken down and the parts it's made of. It actually comes from the word in Greek meaning ruling father. So it literally means to be ruled by a father, and that's very, very apt in this case. We can also think about patriarchal readings of the text. So that's a gendered reading of the text where we interpret its themes with the guise of a male, and with kind of dominance to the views of a male in that sense. But it's also very much influenced by gender stereotypes and expectations of the time. We know that the Elizabethan era was very, very different in the way in which men and women were treated, and obviously women were not given a great deal of equality or choice or a voice, even in wealthy families like the Capulets. In fact, Juliet gets less of a voice because of that. Her duties are even more heavily encoded within the society. So the moment where Juliet refuses to marry Paris, this is the kind of tirade that she receives from her father. He says things like, "Hang thee, young baggage, out green sickness carrying, disobedient wretch, never look me again in the face, hang, beg, starve, die in the street," all those kind of things. And if we look at this as a patriarchal reading, we can argue that Juliet is punished by fate for disobeying her father and failing to fulfill those womanly duties that she needs to within that strict patriarchal Elizabethan society. So that is the patriarchal reading of the text, that in fact the outcome for Juliet is a result of that dissent, that refusal to follow the orders of her father, which again in a society at the time would have been an even more pervasive influence on her life, and one that she was expected to obey. So if we do a little bit of quote explosion, again I'd like you to pause here please, and what I'd like you to do is to pick this up in a moment, and we'll do some annotations together of the quotations and some of the things that we can think about. But I've taken a couple of quotations, key quotations, from the moment of the arrangement of the marriage to Paris, to her refusal to marry Paris, to after Juliet's death, to see how the language Capulet uses about his daughter develops. Now you've got 3 assessment objectives in GCSE English Literature. AO1 is the writer's ideas. What ideas is Shakespeare hoping to convey, and how does he do that? You select quotations to show that. AO2 is language analysis or structural analysis. It might be something like dramatic irony or repeated motif, something like that, but it's devices, effectively, similes, metaphors, those kind of things. Or AO3 is gold themes and context. So with these quotations, I want you to have a look at them, do a bit of quote explosion, try and include all those things. What language analysis could you do? Which words could you pick out that are significant? All of those kind of things here would work really, really well for helping you pick up those marks for practicing that kind of language analysis. Okay, so when you're ready to continue, some of the things that you might have highlighted and might have thought about. In the first quotation, she's the hopeful lady of my earth. The word hopeful lady is quite a respectful address term, but not only that, it shows this sense of idolization, idolatry of his daughter, this idea that he kind of places her on this pedestal. When he says she's hopeful lady of my earth, that symbolises the idea, that hyperbole symbolises the idea that she is his whole world. But the use of the my could hint at that idea of ownership, the idea that yes, she's important to him, but essentially he controls her and dominates her. The quotation, let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride. Here Capulet is saying that he doesn't think she's old enough to be married. When Paris initially asks. Look at the use of the words to do with kind of growth and maturity. So when he says ripe to be a bride, we get that idea of her being ready to be a bride. There's that idea to do with fertility. But then equally, wither is that idea of death, as though he needs to make sure that she's not becoming past her prime. He knows it's important to marry her off. But he equally wants to protect her as well here. He says, let 2 more summers wither. He wants 2 more years to pass before she can marry. So we get that sense of protection, actually. However, when she refuses to marry Paris just a short while later, he uses an aggravated imperative, hang thee, young baggage. So he gives her a command. I would like to hang you, effectively. He calls her young baggage, that metaphor as though she's a burden or a hindrance on him. Disobedient wretch, again, somebody wretched is somebody unfortunate, and he almost is referring to her as though she was like a destitute woman living on the street at this point. He kind of says he would rather she was destitute and living on the street. So all of those address terms are abusive and aggressive, and certainly reinforce that patriarchal reading that she is being punished for dissenting against her father. He calls her green sickness carrying, again, similar ideas. But he says, hang, beg, starve, die in the street. The use of those quite aggressive verbs, hang, beg, starve, a run of 1-word imperatives. An imperative is a command. So he basically throws her out onto the street. And at the time, Shakespeare's time, to be an unmarried woman who had been cast out of a noble family would essentially to be destitute and living on the streets. She would have been forced to make her living on the streets. She would have been forced to live on the streets. She probably would have died in awful suffering. So he's almost willing death on her rather than dishonour. And then finally, but when she dies, that tune changes. Death lies on her like an untimely frost. The idea of the imagery of winter, the idea that her life has been ended too early. The word untimely frost reminds us of her youth, as though the winter time has come too early. So that symbolism there about coldness and winter and that disconnection from her daughter, from his daughter. He also says, my child and my joys. So he aligns her in that second one with joy and happiness, as though she is the thing that will bring him happiness. But he uses that possessive pronoun, my child, to show that idea that she's kind of owned by him even in death. The hyperbole, my joys are buried, that metaphor, shows the misery and depression that has fallen upon him with the death of his child. So that has really changed. If we think about at the beginning, he's kind of empathetic and he's kind and he cares for her. Then he becomes abusive and tyrannical and cruel towards her. And then he becomes regretful and loving again upon her death. So structurally, it's quite an interesting progression of the character. Okay, so this is what the question will look like. You'll remember that this looks very, very similar to your one that you did for your assessment. This was actually from the exam paper in 2018. This was the extract. So if this were the extract and the question in the exam, what quotations would we explore? And it says, starting with this moment in the play, explore how Shakespeare presents relationships between adults and young people in Romeo and Juliet. Now, really, really, really important is that these are your keywords, so you must highlight them first. Remember, if it's a how, it's a language question, always. And remember, it says just starting with the extract, which means that you need to select things from elsewhere as well, from your gold quotation list or from the earlier slides. The key word, though, is the relationships between adults and young people. So anything I select must be about that, relationships between adults and young people. I'm going to start with this section, which is Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet and Juliet, but I can select anything from anywhere else about relationships between adults and young people. So again, let's just have a pause. You have a look at that extract. Which quotations would you select to answer that question? Okay, so we're now looking at this extract here. You want to select probably 2 to 3 quotations and then relate them to some of the gold from elsewhere. And we want to find quotations that have language devices in them or structural devices that we can mention. And we also want those that relate to these gold ideas. So this relates directly to that patriarchal reading of the text, notions of patriarchy, control, tyranny from Lord Capulet towards his daughter. So that's how the relationship is summed up here. So I would highlight, if it was me, I would the fool were married to her grave. That metaphor from Lady Capulet shows that she's almost wishing death on her daughter. There is that sense of death before dishonour as far as the Capulets are concerned here. And Juliet is almost useless to them if she will not fulfil the duty they have given to her. They're using that address term, the fool, but married to her grave is ironic here because she's essentially signing her own death warrant according to her parents because she refuses to marry, and yet she's already married to Romeo. So marriage, and we could talk about the symbolism of that word, is the downfall of everything. It is marriage that has led to the catastrophic sequence of events. It is love that has been parasitic and caused this dangerous thing for her. But her parents see her only as a commodity, as something that will advance their station and benefit them. I also quite like these rhetorical questions here. Does she not give thanks? Is she not proud? Doth she not count her blessed? Because this run of kind of 3 rhetorical questions shows us the disbelief of Capulet, that he expects absolute obedience from his daughter, and that the fact that he has found for her a good marriage, she should consider a blessing. She should count her blessed. She should be proud. She should understand her duty within the society. And again, if we look down here, we could talk about these address terms he uses again: baggage, tallow face, green sickness carrion, all those kind of things that make her seem almost kind of parasitic and worthless in the eyes of her father. And so this shows us a huge amount here about how she's treated by her father. She even says, go to the church, or I will drag you on a hurdle thither. I will drag you there. Okay, so again, quite aggressive language used by her father, shows that she is controlled and that they expect obedience, and when she dishonours them, it's met with great hatred. Now, I then need to decide which quotations I want to select from elsewhere. So I would definitely select one from earlier on that is about Capulet's worshipping language towards his daughter, or the language he uses after her death to show the regret. So either how he feels about her at the beginning when he's got obedience, or how he feels at the end when he's lost his daughter. I would also, if I was you, select one from the friar or the nurse to show that contrast between loving maternal and parental characters and those who seem quite cold and quite distant. You could even use those address terms, what lamb, what ladybird, alongside my daughter. You could even use the words of advice that are given by the friar. You could talk about the two of them becoming complicit in the deaths because of the absence of parental guidance and the fact they tried to step into that role. Okay. So just a reminder to you, this is how we write up this kind of question. Again, I'll put this all on the VLE because this is going to be your follow-up work. Okay, so we must start with an introduction. We want 2 quotations from the text, from the extract, 2 from elsewhere, and we do this by saying, firstly, in the extract, we analyse a quotation from the extract using a normal peel as we would, and then we link to something from elsewhere to show how it's different or the same in the way it represents relationships between adults and children. And I'm going to give a quotation from my gold quote or somewhere else. But I want to write approximately 4 peels, PQELs, in detail, saying as much as I can about each individual one. You did that really well in the practice ones that you did for your assessment. What you must do now is to act on that advice. So your follow-up work, complete the essay question, use the guidance from your teacher during this lesson. You can rewatch this video to remind you what to do if you want to. 2 quotations from the extract, 2 from elsewhere in the text. You could use the ones that I've just selected for you if you prefer. Act on the feedback that your teacher gave you last time on your extract tasks. Let's make this one even better. Access the next gold lesson on the VLE. That'll be another lesson that I put on there. It's a bit shorter than this one because it's not a full hour. It's just a very quick run through of some more gold, this time binary oppositions of light and dark in the play and the theme of sickness and corruption in Verona. Then I'm going to give you some independent analysis practice using 2 extract questions. Now you can write those out in full if you like, or you can just practice planning them. Depends how confident you feel, but the more of these extracts you read and annotate on your own, the better. And then finally, as an extension, if you want, you can create your cue cards for the gold quotations that are in your quotation bank. On the YouTube channel, there's a video called How to Make a Great Lord of the Flies cue card. It's the same process for Romeo and Juliet, but that will just remind you how to do that. You have a blank quotation on one side and an annotated version on the other, and then that'll be plenty for you to keep getting on with this week. Okay, well done. Good luck with all your work continuing, and I will speak to you very soon.